So today we're going to do the Book of Ruth. That's the entire class is going to be on this. And if you're thinking now, why are we doing this now? Then one reason is that I was just looking for places to stick things, like if you had a larger topic. But the other is that the Book of Ruth is cast as an explanation of David's background, right? That if you get to the end of the book, even though that's not so much what it's about in terms of the women involved, then you suddenly find out that Ruth is David's grandmother. And so, in fact, the book is meant to be this explanation of how David got to be who he is. So I thought, all right, we'll put it at the beginning of the kingship section. That's as good a place for it as any. But really what we're going to do today is focus on women in ancient Israel as visible in this book. And the thing is that for all that you know that there were women and there were children and there were old people and there were foreigners and so on, you only get a selective picture of who's around, and the biggest gap is often the women, since you're talking about scribes who are men, and the focus of storytelling is often men. Institutionally, things tend to be run more by men. So if you're thinking, well, so where are the women in ancient Israel, and how on earth do we get at them? Then this one biblical book is almost the single best part of the Bible, at least, to get at the women in ancient Israel. So I want you to help me do it today. Now, I'm going to close the door. So I'm going to start with my class objective. And then I wanted to review just a couple things about the Book of Ruth. And then I have two large sections, and this is pretty much the whole class, looking at the Book of Ruth together, and I want you to help me. So the first one, I was trying to decide what order to put these in, and I reversed them at the last minute. But what I'm going to do first is the one that's closer to what your Blackboard post is, which is to ask, well, what do you learn about women in society from the Book of Ruth? What are the clues? What can you tell me? And can you give me a specific enough sense so that we have a sense of what Ruth and Naomi in particular represent, and we don't just automatically say, this is women's lives, treated automatically as universal. But the other thing I wanted to do with the last part of the class is, as I was reading through this, and I don't know, it's hard to imagine nobody suggested this, but I just thought this is such a women's story. It looks like it was written by a woman, or at least a story told by a woman. I don't know if you want to buy into this particular line of thought, but it does. And so we'll have to see. Mari will tell me why I'm all wrong. I don't really care in a way, right? Like I have not written an article on this or incorporated it into my research in any large-scale way. But I'll tell you, in a way that I've looked at this book a lot, and in a way that never struck me before, I thought, this really would work. Not for Mari, maybe. She's like shaking her head. What, are you crazy? What do you guys think? We'll see. So with the last part, I wanted to kind of ask you this question. And it doesn't matter where you come out, but it's an interesting way to get at the issue of who are we listening to and whose perspective on women are you hearing? Is it imaginable that you could be hearing a woman's or women's perspective on women in ancient Israel when you read this book, as opposed to men's idea of women's lives? And so that's the last section, okay? To start, then, here's what I put down as my class objective. Though in this case, it's cast as a question. Can you imagine a world where women's measure of success in life is the ability to bear children? especially sons. Can you imagine that women themselves would want this, not just as compelled by men? Can you imagine any positive aspect of such a life? So my objective is cast in terms of these questions. Do you want me to repeat anything? Can you imagine a world where women's measure of success in life is the ability to bear children, especially sons? Can you imagine that women themselves would want this, not just as compelled by men? Can you imagine any positive aspect of such a life? Can you? Does this seem like an unlikely proposal? And I mean, I leave it as a question. Go ahead.
Do you mean the question as if it was to happen today? Or, because I feel like
Yeah.
this was the case back in the day, but not necessarily today.
Yeah, no, I'm asking it for them, of course. Yeah, I'm asking it for them. But I guess I'm asking it. I guess when you start asking about women's lives and women's attitudes toward their lives, and men's attitude towards women's lives in an ancient setting, or even a modern setting that's just really culturally more conservative or traditional or unlike ours, then, at least to my mind, the first necessary step is to figure how do I get enough outside of my own assumptions and enough outside my own world to enter sympathetically into somebody else's world and try to imagine how they think about it. And it's not an automatic thing to my mind, that in fact, I mean, it's so hard to do this, right? To imagine yourself back into an ancient world at all, but in this case, to imagine yourselves into the women's part of that ancient world. And you almost can't do it without bringing assumptions or expectations from our own world in. There's a whole tradition of doing this with the ancient world and with the Bible, and it heads off in totally different directions that reflect so much the attitude of the people doing the project. There are people who have come at this saying, look, women were oppressed in the ancient world. It's a patriarchal society. Lots of bad things were done to women. Women are stripped of their power. And that's how it was. And that if you read these stories and you want to understand what's going on, the key thing to do to understand is to recognize the degree to which women have been stripped of their power, stripped of their identity, everything about them kind of identified by the men around them. And then you can begin to understand what women's lives were like. And there's a real logic to that. I'm not putting that out as a straw man, so to speak. So, flip side, though, you can get people who are interested in these sorts of questions coming at, say, the Bible and saying, well, yeah, it's in this patriarchal society and that's all there, but look at how many women there are that have positive roles and do have power. And, so they kind of turn the question on its head and they ask all these positive questions of the material. But of course, both sides of this can come with their modern agendas, right? What do you want out of the material? And so in this case, I'm not pushing one over the other, but I want you to realize how hard it is to get back into the ancient world in this respect, and how important it is in some ways to ask both of those questions, to put them both on the table and look at what you have. I do think that there's some danger of, in any cultural, kind of cross-cultural situation, of imposing your values on their culture. And that's why I put the question the way I did, and sort of, so not for us, but for them. Though out of our culture, can we imagine, as we approach the Book of Ruth, for instance, that this would reflect what women, or some women, might actually have wanted? Yeah?
Could you repeat the second half of the class?
So the second part, the second question was, can you imagine that women themselves would want this, not just as compelled by men? Can you imagine any positive aspect of such a life? Another thought? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I know a lot of women today that the only reason why they're going to school and trying to get a career so that they'll get married and have kids. And as soon as they have kids, they're going to stop working and just raise their kids for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just a thing of the past, is it? Right?
No.
And it's not even just a thing of people from other countries. It's absolutely. And so, in some ways, in imagining what I'm asking you to imagine for this ancient world, I'm partly suggesting that we imagine it for people around us as well. And, and we had some version of this conversation once before, right, where it's, this is something that men and women today, your age, are going to have to sort of work out, right? I mean, where marriage and kids and family sort of fit in everything else that's going to be your life. And right now you can think, I'm just a student and those issues aren't on the table. But you wait 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, and some of those things begin to look more urgent. Not to be too personal, but I will say something personal. My wife and I have 3 adopted children. We adopted them from inner city Cincinnati, and they gave us a run for our money. They're now 17, 19, and 20, almost 21. Really rough shape, and these kids came with a lot of baggage, and they did not just get through it. The story behind us doing this is that we were unable to have kids, and especially for my wife, who was an incredibly smart person, worked for Hewlett-Packard, sort of high-end career track, but she got to a certain point, and she thought, I don't want it. Like, when I get old, am I going to have a family? Are there going to be, who's after me? Like, who I'm going to know, who's going to come see me or care about me, or whom I can care about, right? This is real now, these questions. But of course, what's a little bit shocking when you get into this world is to imagine that that's somehow like the only thing. And let me tell you, this is just a picture that's always stuck in my head. I'm writing a book with a French woman who's a legal scholar, and we're studying ancient society together, not in the biblical stuff. It's outside the Bible. And but she really is one of the world's experts in ancient law. But she's especially interested in ancient law for ancient society, really understanding how law carries out what people need to arrange in their lives, in their families, in their communities. And so at one point she just tossed out this notion, which she meant in a very specific way, that she was beginning to wonder if women in the ancient world only became persons when they had children. So if you take what you put out there as people right? And you think, well, what if as a woman you could only be a person, a full human person recognized in society when you had a child? Do you follow what I mean? So if you never could, for whatever reason, that you would just not fully be a person. And what she meant was legally a person, even, like able to own property and so on. Yeah?
So if we're trying to understand in the context of the ancient world, on one hand, if we look at the Bible, there's many stories of women who couldn't give birth, like Sarah.
Yeah.
Or Hannah.
Yes.
And it's like that's like the beginning of their story. So there's an emphasis on like the idea of having children. So it must have been very.
Yeah. I mean, he's pointing out that there's a bunch of stories in the Bible, especially as you work your way through the genealogies of the background of Israel, sort of Abraham and Sarah, and I mean, even a little bit Isaac and Rebekah, definitely. You work your way on down. There's this whole thing of Jacob and Leah and Rachel and the sort of difficulty that Rachel has having children. And then there is, Hannah, who's the mother of Samuel. There are these stories. The interesting thing about all those stories is with those stories you can see a straight line toward if not the male interest, at least the kind of national interest, right? That the stories are told for who the sons will be. And the Book of Ruth ends up in that boat because you don't care maybe who Ruth's immediate son is, but her grandson is going to be David, and that ends up being the big issue. But what's intriguing is that if you get into the guts of the story itself, it's almost not interested in who the kids will be. It's more interested in Ruth. This is probably my son calling and telling me that his soccer game was canceled and therefore he wants to get a ride home, which I'm not really in a position to do, if you didn't notice. So, sorry about the phone. Should have turned it off before I came. I'll turn it off now. It's because it's raining. Okay. All right. He'll probably call me back. Okay, son number 3, the only one left at home. Yeah, so this is a good line of thought, and it's going to be shared by the Book of Ruth, but there's something different about the way the Book of Ruth handles it. Question?
Oh, I think that, well, the women during that time, I think, yes, they would want that, what was it, the second one? They would imagine as well.
Can you imagine them wanting it themselves?
Yes, I definitely think so. I think that they were, in a way, preconditioned, just like the men. And the things that they were of importance then had more to do with survival versus in a time like now. And giving birth to children, just like it's something very special that only women can do. So, like you said, it's something that, yes, it gives value to them. It's like the one thing that they did have power over, and being able to do that. And yeah, I mean, as far as contributing to society, it was something that they felt that was the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I think you're right that you can imagine this. And so by putting the question out there, then as we begin to read the book or talk about having read it, then in a way I want us all to start with that possibility in mind. And it is, but of course, this is a tension, because if I go back to my suggestion, even that it's possible to imagine a woman having told this story, that it be a story by and for women. If it's not, then there's a sort of check to this whole line of thought. Because if it's not a story that's by and for women, if it's a story that's really by and for men and just about women, then we got to be really careful what conclusions we draw from this, because we're just getting a kind of idealization of women's roles that is put out there by men. So that this kind of shade comes down between us and the ancient women, so that we can get a sense again of what men are expecting of them, but not what women expect of themselves. So that even if we could imagine that they might buy in to this picture and really want it themselves, we don't really have evidence for that. So that brings us back to this question at the end. All right, so all this said, let me say a couple of things about the Book of Ruth, just by way of framing it. And then we'll come to the question of women in society as portrayed in the book, which is what I'd asked you about in the Blackboard post. First of all, I just want you to realize what a unique book this is when it comes to asking a question about women. There are plenty of women in stories of the Bible, Genesis, all these mothers who are having trouble having kids, the ancestral mothers. There are wives, and there are queens, and occasionally there might even be a prophet, or there's Deborah. There's all sorts of interesting women that turn up here and there, but the main characters of the Bible are often men. And even where women show up as main characters, they often are involved in events that will finally have men at the center of them. And so, if you look at individual books even, there's another book with a woman's name, Esther. And you could say, well, okay, there should be another book where you could look at women's lives or women's attitudes. Well, what is Esther? She's the queen of Persia, you could say, or a queen at least, in the harem of the king of Persia after the end of Israel and Judah. And she's elected to be a new queen because she's so beautiful and has such good attitude or something. And then, what happens? Well, it turns out that the Jewish people, at least in some part of the kingdom, are in real danger because somebody within the royal court has taken offense at this Jewish guy who's actually Esther's uncle or something. And so she, as queen, is finally put in a position to save her people by interceding with the king on their behalf. All great stuff, right? But it doesn't tell you much about women's lives and women's roles. I mean, she's made into this heroine. The Book of Ruth is really unusual in that it is the characters are women. The main characters are women, and the men have supporting roles, pretty much. So there's probably no other book in the Bible, or even section of a book in the Bible, that gives you this kind of focus on, in this case especially, a relationship between two women and their situation. This is Ruth and her mother-in-law. So whoever wrote it, and whatever you do with it, there are things we might learn from this book we're just not going to learn anywhere else. So that's why I chose it. Okay? I already said that Ruth is David's grandmother. In its final form, at least, the book is cast as part of the David story, you could even say. David's background. A couple of other details connected to the book. We don't know when it was written. I mean, we can say that of a lot in the Bible, maybe. But the thing that's important is to realize that it's usually considered a fairly late book. And one reason for saying so would be the opening. So maybe I'll go ahead and, thanks, Mari. If we look at the way the book begins, it sets the book in the time of Judges. And I don't know if you remember from when we spent a couple of different classes where we looked at a couple of different passages from Judges. And I tried to give you a sense of how the book of Judges is a collection, where if you look at the individual stories, sometimes the picture of society and history that you get seems quite independent of the larger framework. And it's more that when all of these stories were put together into a book of Judges, that they were given a framework and certain categories that go with that. Well, the very category of Judges is part of that framework. So that, for instance, when we read Gideon chapter 8, or if you read the Song of Deborah all by itself, you would never think, oh, Deborah was a judge, Gideon was a judge. It doesn't call them that. It's not even clear in the case of Gideon, if you remember, that he rules all Israel when he goes chasing after these people in the desert. But in the scheme of the book as a whole, each one of these judges was raised up by God to rescue the people from oppression, and each one of those judges did rule over all of Israel just for that judge's own lifetime, and then when they died, the people got in trouble again until God allowed another judge to come on the scene. This is the framework. So if you start at the beginning, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Just that opening section means that the book of Ruth, at least in this form, was written when the book of Judges was complete, or almost complete, right? When the book of Judges was considered a book of Judges. And the way you talk about that period before Kings was in terms of a time of Judges. So that would be one of the big reasons why, just right off the top, scholars would look at this book of Ruth and say that the text was probably written fairly late, and by that what they would tend to mean is after 586, like after there is no more Israel, after there is no more Judah, in a time when the Bible's getting kind of put together. So even though the story is about a character from before there were kings, it's not generally viewed as having been written then. Now, if in a way you say, well, yeah, it's just the opening line, though, and the stuff about David at the end is the last two lines of the book. If you just look at the story on its own, it doesn't really involve Judges, and it doesn't really involve David. How do you know how old that story is? And the answer would be, you're right, we don't know. And so the story could be very old. There's just no way to tell. You could pull apart some of the ingredients. She's from Moab, which is in Jordan, other side of the Dead Sea. That's a place that you would not have named as such before, probably the the 10th century or 9th century, something like that. And Naomi is from Bethlehem, which is where David is from. Bethlehem is only an important place because of David. And so it's pretty unlikely that the story is told about Bethlehem before David was on the scene. So it's unlikely that it sends you back before that. But just to give you that sense, it's probably a fairly late story, but could be based on something older. Older, but still with that kind of Kingdom of Judah base because of Bethlehem. The book doesn't really have a political interest. So it's not national in this sense of worrying about what happens to Israel as a whole. Mainly, that's only in the closing where it says it turns out Ruth is David's grandmother. And then finally, one last thing just to notice, which is the role of religion in this book. It's interesting to make the comparison with the book of Esther. Esther is famous because it's one of 2 books in the Bible that never mentions God. So you could think, what's a book doing in the Bible that doesn't care about God? Well, it does care about the Jewish people, so that seems to be how it gets in. But unlike that, Ruth does mention God or Yahweh in various contexts. In fact, I think if we just sort of scroll don't change the text, but where do you first see the Lord? The Lord grant that you may find security. May the Lord deal kindly. Right. So around verses 8 and 9, when Naomi is getting ready to say, to go back home to Judah, she invokes God, you could say, invokes Yahweh. May Yahweh deal kindly with you as you've dealt with the dead and with me. Yahweh grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband, meaning future husband. And there are other lines like that throughout the book. That God comes up pretty frequently in this book. But the thing to notice is that God never appears, right? God never talks. God never communicates. There's no... The experience of these people with God is kind of like people today's experience with God, right? That you may pray, you may make a blessing, you may, swear an oath, you may feel bitter and angry because you feel like God has let you down, but there's no personal encounter where God speaks to you through a prophet or directly in a dream or comes and appears to you, or which you could say, well, of course not. But if you live in the Bible and you were part of Genesis or something like that, then yeah, you might get a visit from God, right? But not in the book of Ruth. So as we read that, at least it means that God's present in terms of religion being present, but God is not an actor in this story, really. And that's just to say that all the more it's a story about these women. And so the religious part is there because that's part of their lives, but it's not the same as a situation where God is showing up. So keep that in mind, all right? So with all that out there, that brings us to the first of the categories I wanted you to help me with. All right? And I'd sort of made my own... I went through the book looking for my own observations, but I don't have the prompt in front of me for what I'd asked you for the Blackboard post. But what I was after was for you to tell me what you can learn about women's lives in society from this book. And you can give me any detail at all that you discovered that would help. And although we can't put the whole thing on at once, if we're talking about something, we'll scroll through and find it. So what do you have? What do you want to put out there? And there's kind of 2 questions. There's what do you find about women's lives? And then there's this question of what can you find about these particular women that distinguishes them from women in general? So yeah, go ahead.
In the story, the women were really, their identities were really attached to men in several different ways. At the beginning, they're introduced in relation to their husbands.
Okay.
And then at the end, in the middle, they go to Boaz as a male member of Naomi's family.
Yep.
But at the end, when there's finally that redemption that is offered for both women, they come through men. In
Yep.
Naomi's case, in her ability or opportunity to raise a child with royal lineage, and
Yep.
in Ruth's case, through marriage to a man with power.
Okay, so I don't know if everybody could hear all of those things, right? But that it's amazing how much, so the first is that the women are identified in terms of men. Their possibilities are defined in terms of men. The tension in the story is resolved because a man is found who can solve it. And so this is really, for sure, the case in the story, almost kind of shockingly so, right? If you think to what extent all of their choices are constrained by their relationships with men and what happens. For instance, if like all the men you're dependent on die, which is how the whole story begins. So on one hand, you sort of remove all the men from the story, which you think, well, that's great. It gives us a chance to look at the women on their own for once. But of course, even then, they're defined by that, right? They're defined both that they were married to them and now that they don't have them. So if you ask about society and you want to talk about a patriarchal framework, well, here it is, right? Did you have right behind you? Yeah, go ahead.
It was a very specific custom that they had in order to redeem land of the woman.
Did you follow all that? And this would be worth. Do you want to find us this? This is in chapter 4.
It was a little confusing. They had a random guy named so and so was the translation.
Yeah, right.
And they said that he needed to redeem the land for the woman and then marry Mary.
Did he have to?
And
Yeah.
he said that he couldn't do it because he couldn't marry her.
Right. This is actually probably worth looking at because it's another important part of the kind of structure that these women are embedded in. And it was also somewhat confusing. I actually, when I went back over this yesterday, tried to make sure I understood it myself, especially because there's really two women involved, right? So this is a little bit relates to what you had just said, right? That when you said, oh, well, there's some sort of family member of Naomi, but of course it's actually not. Did you catch that? This guy Boaz, he's not related to Naomi. He's related to her husband. So talk about another connection with a male, right? Yeah, so you get this situation where, how are these guys translating it? Well, so the thing is that Naomi has Ruth approach this guy, Boaz, who seems like a pretty good guy, right? And try to make some kind of marriage arrangement. But the problem seems to be that there's this piece of land. Now, who did the land belong to that's in question? Yeah. Yeah, Elimelech. So he's which is Naomi's husband. So Naomi's dead husband had this land. So this, just to understand that, in the picture of life in ancient Israel and Judah, it's hard to know for sure how these things worked, but the biblical sense of it is that families had their own ancestral land, and you weren't supposed even to sell that land. And so in this picture, can you tell, it was not sold, right? So he's got this land, the family land that belongs to her husband, but it wasn't sold. Can you tell what happened? Anybody, help me. What happened to this land? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's a next of kin sort of situation that the land automatically goes to, which is, I believe, the so-and-so character. And then
But does that so-and-so character have the land already? No. So good, you're good so far as you're going, but I want you to step back a pace. Who's got the land now then?
Naomi, I guess. Well, no one, because that's the whole point of the meeting, so Boaz can take over the land that no one's really claimed.
Well, so, all right, this is the sort of question, I think I'll have an answer for you, but it's not really clear, and I want you to think about it. Yeah, go ahead, have a try.
Didn't it say in verse 5, it says, then Boaz said, the day you acquired the field from the hand of Naomi,
Yep.
didn't it presently belong to him?
Yeah, so that's partly what I mean by, so the argument is that the land does belong to Naomi, and that would be because her husband's dead, so it was Elimelech's land, but they're married, so she's somehow got rights to it. But if she has rights to it, so for one, if we go back in the story, so when they first arrive back in Bethlehem, what do they do? Do you remember? What's the first thing you're told happens? Here, chapter 2. So yeah.
The whole town is really excited that they're back.
Okay, whole town's excited they're back.
And she doesn't want anyone to know that she's there, or she's claiming, hey, you can't call me Naomi anymore because I'm not
Yeah.
oh, like my whole, like all my family's gone, I don't have my land anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm
And
not
this
the
name
woman
Mara
that I
means bitter.
is.
Yeah.
So you're
Just,
not the woman that you think I am.
yeah. Just call me bitter, capital B. You know, pretty much, right? You know people like that. That struck a little too close to home. I don't know. Yeah. So she says that. So she's just like, forget it, my life's over. But what happens then? Like, so first thing that happens is somebody does something. Help me. This is a participatory class session. What happens? Ruth does something, right? Yeah. Yeah, it is what I'm looking for. She goes to work in a field. So what does the fact that Ruth goes to work in a field tell you about Naomi's property? Yeah.
That they don't have their own food and they don't
Yeah.
have their own crop.
They're not farming their own land. They're not farming their own land. So on one hand, she owns it still, but she's not farming it. That's where Ruth should be. And it's not that women don't work in the fields. Yeah, go ahead.
It kind of seems like she owns it just because of the situation, but she doesn't have like a legal right to it. in some
Yeah?
sense.
No, that's good. She owns it, but she doesn't have a legal right to it. Go ahead. First you and then in back. Yeah. Go ahead.
At the same time, it seems that she does have some authority in them because she says specifically, I told the man not to touch you or something like that. She commands.
Well, that's Boaz says that. If you remember, it's actually Boaz who says, I told the men not to touch you. I'm pretty sure that's what you're thinking of. So in that case now, and it's not her own field. So Ruth, this is when Ruth goes and she goes gleaning, which is like picking up at the time of harvest when you drop stuff that doesn't get harvested. Then there's this tradition that at least the Bible talks about that seems to be based on actual practice that the poor could go along and pick up the dregs left behind from the harvest. And in the story, it even says at one point, once he realizes who she is, and he really respects her because of the story about her leaving her own family in order to follow Naomi. And so he says, look, like when you're harvesting, like make sure you just drop a few extra ears and make sure she gets home with plenty. And so this is all happening in the fields that belong to Boaz. And Boaz is Naomi's relative, but it's not her own field. This is his fields. Yeah, and back, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say because like it seems like kind of like that represents wealth in family, and the wealth kind of comes from like the husband side of the lineage. So it's like because Boaz is his.
Okay, that is interesting.
So it's like
Well-
she has some entitlement to it, but it's not hers because it's not her side of the family.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right that Boaz represents wealth that is associated with Elimelech, and it's interesting because then you could think, so I mean, if there's this pretty rich guy that's related, then would he have been really poor, or does that say something about class? And that's a good question where to go with that. But for now, it doesn't actually answer. This land belongs to Boaz. There's no direct connection with Naomi or her husband. And so whatever Boaz does with it is out of his generosity. And so we still don't know what happened to her land. This is not the land, all this whole story about her going on around picking up grains of wheat is not answering the question of what about Naomi's land. And so here's where the other clue is. Yeah, you want to go ahead?
I think kind of also, first of all, I don't understand how Naomi, if Ruth went to a different field, why didn't she just go? I think something must have been different about their field. It didn't have crops already harvested or something like that they can actually get something else. They kind of would have gone there. Or even maybe you're saying it's someone else's. If you really want to say that, I think it's kind of already going to someone, and because then that would mean they have nothing on it. But it's just who's it going to? It has to go to someone. And if someone has some connection in some way, then they'll be first to get it. So the closest connection to Naomi or through Naomi actually got it.
But this is the interesting thing, right? That there's a question of who can buy the land, or at least get rights to the land. And there are two possibilities. There's Boaz, like Ruth and Naomi want Boaz to be the one, But he says, look, I'm not the closest family member. It's got to be somebody else who's in front of me in line. We've got to deal with that before I can have any rights to it. But the point is that neither of those people now has rights over that land or toward the produce of it or anything. That land is in some unknown person's hands that we don't know anything about, except for, I'll tell you, there is another clue, but it's not like I expect you to see it. Go ahead.
Is there also the possibility that they didn't farm the land simply because they were gone to Moab for a while, and because they returned just at that time,
Yeah.
the crops were planted or anything?
Yeah, this is it's a good observation, right? That they've been gone, and it's maybe the first season back. And so I like that observation, although there's another, again, it's because of the issue of ownership that the focus is not on their inability to farm the land or get anything from it. When it comes, in a way, they never focus on the land until the question of marriage. And then, in a way, they're not interested in the land, they're interested in the women. And talk about women's lives and women's roles. The thing that's so fascinating and, I don't know, sort of demoralizing potentially is that the women are just so, they're tied to the family land, so that the only way to make a decision about marrying Ruth, ultimately, is to settle the land question. It's like just an accidental side issue. But here's the other clue. So in Hebrew, this guy Boaz is called a Goel, which you could spell G-O''E-L. And this is the word that's translated in the other text that your JPS translation for class as something like, well, what's it called? Is it the closest kinsman? Sometimes it's called kinsman redeemer. Is that, does somebody have the, anyway. But the term redeemer is part of the translation. At some level, you could say that Goel is a redeemer. And it's somebody who redeems. And you think, well, what is that? Well, it's meant in even just a financial sense. And it's built in, it's not only in this sort of Israelite system of family land and that kind of thing. But in the ancient world, it was not necessarily the case that when you got in financial trouble that you would just sell off your land or even necessarily sell yourself into slavery or your kids, even though those are perfectly good options. But what you could do is you could put yourself under financial obligation or put your land under financial obligation without actually selling it or selling yourself or your children. So you would sell your service or your children's service to somebody, and that might even mean them going and living with somebody and being their servant and whatever, as if they were a slave almost. Or if it's land, it would mean your land being effectively someone else's land. Somebody else gets to farm it, somebody else reaps the benefit of whatever comes off it. It's as if it's their land, except that it does not finally belong to them. And the way that plays out in legal terms is that if you somehow have some rich uncle who could come along and bail you out financially, and that written into the contract by which you alienated your land this way is the possibility that somebody could come on your behalf and pay off the debt. And if that happens, your child comes back, you're freed from service, your land comes back, whatever, right? So in this biblical world, this whole sort of role is defined in terms of the Goel. And the notion that this kinsman redeemer, or whatever you call the person, is somebody in the family who's got the means, potentially, to bail you out, to pay off your debts and release you. Now, the question is then, what's your obligation to that person? And the notion, at least, would be, look, they're related to you, so they might just do it out of the kindness of their hearts. So this whole argument in chapter 4 is about the fact that Ruth and Naomi want Boaz to play this role for them. And he says, look, I would love to do it, but it's governed by kind of how close a relative you are, and I'm not the closest one. There's this other person. And he has first right to do that. I can't just step in and bail you out. Right? So this is the fascinating picture of the land. That's what's going on underneath. But then if you go back to what you're seeing with women, the thing which is strange and intriguing is that what goes with that land when it's the family land is the not just right, but the responsibility to marry the woman whose land it is, right? So when it's the land of a man, and now you have a widow who's been left with just this land as her only possession, her only right, then the fear, of course, is that she's got nothing. She's got no income. She's got no support, no male support, but that's financial support. So what's she going to do? And so the notion is, well, you can't just take her land, or you can't even just redeem her land. You've got to redeem the land and marry her. Why? Because marriage means a financial commitment, a permanent financial commitment, that she's now part of your household, tied to you financially, permanently. So in a way, Boaz should be marrying Naomi, right? And that's why the text is kind of funny that way at a couple points. But of course, what they really want is to arrange for him to marry Ruth. And so it seems to be okay that once Boaz takes on the commitment to care for Naomi, he can actually marry the daughter-in-law. There you go for women's roles. Pretty clever, huh? So sort of spun that one out. Anything else that we're sort of missing? Anything that comes to mind? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I find it interesting that Ruth had to ask Naomi for permission to go glean.
Okay, right? So you see this real generational thing, and in this case, even a daughter-in-law, never mind daughter, has to ask her mother-in-law's permission. Yeah.
I just think that it really stood out for me, just in the beginning of the story, that Ruth left to go with Naomi.
Okay.
I think it's, as a woman in that time, I think it was kind of radical for her to do that instead of going to her father's house.
Yeah, she had an option, according to the story. And her sister-in-law, takes the option, to go to her father. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought it was interesting, too, they make, the author mentioned several times, they sort of mentioned that Ruth's a foreigner.
That
Ruth was a foreigner.
yeah.
She was from Moab, and at one point Ruth seems to think that she deserves less because of her status. She understands that she's not, she was in the field and said, why would you be so nice to me, a foreigner?
Right.
I heard exactly what she said.
Yeah, at least doesn't expect fair treatment almost. So in a way, this is part of an answer to the other part of my question. How much can you universalize the roles of the women involved? And so there's something about Ruth and being a foreigner that puts her in a very particular class of people, so that she's got two things against her, you could say. I mean, she's a woman and she's a foreigner. And so she's doubly constrained. Yeah?
Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah to go back. She says, "Are you saying go back to your father's house?" She says, "Go back to your mother's house."
Yeah, that struck me now that you say.
It seems
Yeah.
interesting because, we think of it as a patriarchal society,
Yep.
looking at evidence through the perspective of men, but through the perspective of women, kind of matriarchal society.
That's a really good observation, and I had forgotten that I noticed it yesterday when I was reading, and it's quite unusual. I mean, in general, in fact, if we were talking about even women in just this situation, we would talk about the father's house. And I'm trying to remember, but remember in Judges 19 when we had the gross story of the concubine who gets slaughtered? The whole story begins when she sort of chooses to divorce her husband, you could say. She leaves the Levite, and she goes back, it says, to her father's house, right? Again, it's her decision. She goes, and it calls it her father's house. So that you're right, the fact that it says mother's house, I don't know if it gives us a matriarchal society, but it absolutely opens the door to this being defined the other way, and defined in terms of the woman, even as a mother. And it's a good question whether that's to assume that, she has no father, that her mother is a widow, or if it's simply going matriarchally in its definition at that point. And I don't have an answer, but it's a good observation. Yeah.
When Ruth first lays at Boaz's feet for the whole, whatever that custom thing was, Boaz praises Ruth, saying something about not choosing younger men when you could have.
Yeah.
So what would that mean as far as the man and the community? If she did choose to marry someone else, not within the family?
Yeah. I mean, what struck me by that was I thought, well, okay, you know, sometimes in very traditional cultures like this, you could say that it would be natural for older men to be marrying younger women because the older men are financially better off. And so, you know, in fact, there are still cultures today where younger men will not marry the loves of their lives because they don't have the means to support. And so either they'll put it off as long as they can just because they feel a cultural obligation to provide that financial support. And so it really, I was struck by that detail as well, and thinking that it clearly defines him as considerably older than Ruth. And just the notion that Ruth herself might prefer a younger man, that's acknowledged. Yeah, it was a little surprising to me, given the sort of framework of the whole thing. Yeah.
When they go back to his comment about her mother's house, when I read that, it made me just like too modern of a concept, that she felt comfortable enough to say that because she was only in the presence of other women. So I kind of felt like maybe it was just because like they were
Yeah.
all going through like a hard time, and that was just kind of like a conversation between women. And if had there been a man present, it would have been
Father's house or something. And of course, again, we're all in a literary construct, right? So it's, you know, a story in which two women are portrayed as conversing, and how would they talk. But I like your idea as another possible explanation that when women were talking between themselves about their family support, that they might speak of it as mothers and rather than fathers. Yeah, go ahead.
Can it just be that daughters like have daughters go with the mom and sons go with the father? Kind of like she's talking to her because she's saying go to your mom because that's where she would relate to, not her father. And it's kind of later on when they go back, and she still directs, like Naomi still directs Ruth where to go. So
Right.
the mom directs the daughter, and maybe the father directs the son.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that if one went that direction, though, of course, Naomi is a widow. And so, you know, Naomi is giving the direction not just because she's a mother, but also because there is no father. And in fact, when it comes to direction, I mean, it's interesting in the Jacob story, for instance, that there's this weird sort of fallout where Jacob and Esau are twins, sons of Isaac and Rebekah. And so it says, well, Esau was the dad's favorite. You know, he was the hunter and the tough guy. And Jacob kind of hung around, like watching what she's cooking and helping out in the kitchen or something like that. And so Rebekah really likes him and sides with him when it comes to this business of who gets this father's blessing. So that would go kind of against the type you're saying. And also, you know, the men are the ones, if they're around, who have the primary financial responsibility. And so that's why you would say father's house, even if it was a woman, like the Levite in Judges 19. But again, I mean, this is why it made me wonder if that's the case, whether it's implying that Ruth was from a family herself where the husband, I mean, where her father had died. So not only had her husband and father-in-law died, but if her father had also died, then maybe just the mother's there. Let me give you just my quick list of my own summary items to notice. You can get a sense of what's out there, right, from all of this. And I'm sure that as you wrote your prompts, you thought of some of these issues. So first of all, the one thing I wanted you to notice is that I think that Naomi and Ruth were poor. So first of all, Naomi's husband had land, but it's now in someone else's control because of debt. I mean, that's what this whole Redeemer thing implies, is that they were in severe debt. And the most likely explanation is that this land was lost before they moved, because that would explain why they moved, right? Why move? If you've got your own land and your own, you know, source of income and support, sustenance, you don't need to move. And so it seems like are you with me on this argument? If you put all of these pieces together, what it looks like, when you know later in the story that Naomi has no land, or her land has been alienated to someone else, and you know that they moved out of their whole homeland because they had no income, then these things would all seem to go together, so that whatever sort of financial background the family came from, by the time they move, they are poor. They move because they're poor. So one thing then that would go with that is that if you look at these marriages, the odds are that Ruth and Orpah, or whatever the other sister-in-law's name is, were probably not from wealthy families. You know, if you show up and you don't really have anything financially, and another confirmation of that would be, well, what happens when everybody dies? They move back, right? They aren't making it where they are. First, they're not making it in Judah, and then they're not making it in Moab. So we're talking about people who are from a sort of lower social class in general. They're living right on the edge. And when the men die, so first of all, they have to move out because they aren't making it. They've lost their land. And then in Moab, when the men die, they have no income. And so they choose to move back and kind of throw themselves on the community, on the mercy and the generosity of the community, because they have nothing. There's this line that keeps showing up in the Bible about taking care of the widows and the orphans. And so if you want to have a kind of stereotype of what it is to be generous and what's required of generosity, it's to take care of the widows and the orphans. Well, here they are, right? Ruth and Naomi are the widows and the orphans, even as adults. The second thing to notice is that they have no male support, right? No husbands, no fathers. So as you watch the story play out, on one hand, they're defined by men and either the presence of men or lack of the presence of men. And yet the story has created a situation, almost artificially, you could say, right? I mean, yes, artificially, right? The whole baseline for the story is to say, okay, imagine a situation where you strip these women of the men who support them. You just lift them off, and then what happens? So in story terms, it creates this rare opportunity to see what women do when stripped of the normal social support. And then the other big detail to pick up on is that Ruth is a foreigner, as someone observed. Her very presence in the story announces Elimelech's desperate choice to move away for survival, and her outsider status makes it harder for her to find a husband and income. Who would want to marry this foreigner? So in a way, you could say that the story presents a kind of a worst-case scenario for women's need. Not only do they lack the male support, but they're coming from a class of society that was already not well off. There's a foreigner now involved as the kind of key player, Ruth. Everything is against them as the story is framed. So with the last part of time that we have, let's go back to my question about, if not authorship, at least the core story. I mean, again, with the David thing at the end and the time of Judges, at least I'm imagining a story that was either written or oral, that has been given its current frame, you could say, by this, okay, here we are, just in case you have no idea what to do with this story. We're in the time of Judges. And yeah, it's got Bethlehem in it, and we're talking about Judah. Whether or not David is from the very beginning the focus, yes, in case you have any doubt, it's about David. But as a story, it kind of has its own life. And so when I talk about the possibility of a woman's story, a story by or for women, then I'm not necessarily talking about its final written version, though it could be. And again, I have nothing in particular at stake. For sure, I could be wrong. I'm not generally somebody who's advocated the likelihood that anything in the Bible is written by women. It just kind of struck me as I read this one. So I have my own list, and I'll try to make sure that I take a few minutes at the end to go through my list of features that could work at this level. But what do you think? Like if you put this out there, again, now think as if you were writing a paper. I don't want just your opinion. I want to know the evidence and your reasoning. Right? So how would you go about making an argument as if before a jury for the possibility that this was written by women, or against it? Like if you think, no, I don't buy it. I think it really sounds like it was finally written by men or told by men or for men. Like, how would you make that argument? Go ahead.
Well, I guess there are a couple of things that were done by women that were a little unconventional, and they weren't written as if they were sinful or inappropriate, but rather kind of written as if they were brave movements.
Okay, so what are you thinking of? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but
Well, I know there was the way that Ruth approached Boaz and kind of
yeah,
was very upfront about the marriage proposal and
yeah.
did it fearlessly, and that wasn't, like, he wasn't reprimanding her for that.
Yeah, so
Maybe,
yeah, there's this story. I don't know if you caught all this. It's a little bit funny language. I mean, so Naomi tells Ruth to go to Boaz at night, more or less, which is already a little fishy, and to sort of show up there and kind of sneak up to him. And when he asks what she's doing there, to ask if he would cover her with his garment, or I don't know exactly. So where's this? It's chapter. So she, let's see. The man, at midnight, the man was startled. This is verse 8. And turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." That's this term. But this is the formal language of marriage. So this notion, in fact, there are a couple places in the Bible where a bride is portrayed as having been naked before she's married, only in the sense that in this sort of covering of her, the man is taking financial responsibility for her. And so, yeah, but I mean, it's very forward, and it clearly involves putting her and him in this awkward position because they are not married, and he even has her leave while it's still dark, so as not to embarrass her, it says. Yeah, so that's interesting. Anybody else? Where would you go with this? Yeah.
I think what's interesting is that, like, at the beginning, it seems like a worst case scenario who we're talking about, and how Naomi says she's lost everything, the Lord has struck her down. But in the end, she ends up getting a second chance at raising a son, even though she can't bear children anymore.
Yeah.
And going with how important it was to have children, it questions how they ended up faring so well from such a bad situation. So it makes you wonder if someone was rooting for them, and if they wanted them to really, because you don't really expect things to turn out very well in the beginning, but in the end, it's much, much better.
Yeah, so pointing out that you go from this sort of worst case scenario to the kind of fairy tale ending, in a sense, right? And I mean, I think that the two are meant to go together in terms of this as a story, that you're supposed to be able to imagine that they are taken from the worst possible situation to the best possible outcome. And it is, I like the observation that that the child is almost Naomi's, not even Ruth's. And that resonates in a funny way with the fact that Boaz almost should have been marrying Naomi. And it's interesting that in her argument with Ruth, when she's trying to tell Ruth, like, go home, don't be an idiot, she says, what? I don't have any more sons to marry off to you, and I'm not going to have any more sons, even if I were to get married. I'm too old. And so there's almost this sense that she has to have Ruth go marry Boaz, because Boaz can't marry her and produce a son. She has to do it through her daughter-in-law, which is one more indication of Ruth's generosity. It's almost as if Ruth is not having this for herself or doing this for herself, but for her mother-in-law. let me go through my list with the last bit of time that we have. And this is to give you a sense of how I thought that I would think about this question. So I had two categories, all as just a possibility. So the first category is the portrayal of characters, and the second is the kinds of issues that are of interest. So portrayal of characters, issues of interest. So if you start with the portrayal of characters. First, Naomi's husband and sons are faceless and off stage. They get names, which is intriguing. But by the first time you meet them, they're dead, which tends to kind of lower their ability to take part in the action. They say nothing. There is no will or set of instructions from them. You know, Elimelech didn't make arrangements. Their identity is, you could almost turn this on its head. Yes, the women are defined by the men, you could say, but the identity of these men is actually defined by the women. Who are the active characters? Who are the ones that get speaking roles? Who are the ones that you're supposed to care about? The women. And the men are there just as props in narrative terms. They only die, I said. And the funny thing is that if you look at sort of feminist readings of biblical stories or ancient stories, sometimes exactly the reverse is said of women. You know, that some woman shows up as a prop, like Dinah in the story of, this is the only daughter of Jacob who gets raped. And she's named, but she kind of disappears from the story as soon as she's been raped. She really is just there to cause this offense that results in, you know, all of bunch of natives of the land getting killed and whatever. But it's interesting to see all that turn on its head. All right, so that's my first argument in terms of the characters, that Naomi's husband and sons are faceless and offstage. Second point, the story is set up only by the interplay of three women, and especially the young ones. Right? So if in chapter 1, the whole thing revolves around Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. So just as you have these three men who are off stage because all they do is die, you have three women. And the thing that struck me about this is that they represent a duality of choices. Like, in a way, you could say Ruth is the ideal, and Orpah, the other one that disappears from the story, you could say maybe made the wrong decision, or at least she doesn't make the heroic decision. They've all lost the men in their lives, and Naomi decides the only way that she is going to survive is to go back to Bethlehem and throw herself on the mercy of her community. And she does not expect her daughters-in-law to go with her. They're not even from this place. They're Moabite. They should go back to their Moabite families. And apparently they have families to go back to. But here's the interesting thing in terms of the telling of this story. Orpah is not demonized. That she's presented in a very sympathetic way. She actually takes the first couple of steps toward going with Naomi as well. I mean, it portrays them all as beginning to go. They all head out back, and only then does Naomi say, look, you know, let's be realistic. You guys should go back to where you'll get some support, right? So it says, then she started, verse 6, then she started to return with her daughters-in-law, right? So they're already headed back, but then they get to a certain point, maybe as they're getting close to the land or something, and she says, look, go back. And even then, Orpah and Ruth together say, no, you know, we'll stay with you. See, verse 10, they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. And then Naomi argues again. And finally, Orpah responds to her persuasion and says, okay, you know, this makes sense, and is very kind. And yet Ruth then at that moment represents the other pole and says, forget it. No, I'm with you to the death. It just says, you know, I'm part of your family, and that's it. And clearly that's the ideal, right? She has this heroic role. But what strikes me is that the whole situation is set up by the interplay between these three women, all of whom are portrayed in some sense, well, at least very sympathetically. They're all different from each other. They play a different role. And yes, Ruth's the heroine, but I'm impressed by the way those three characters are drawn. And then, so this is now my third example under the portrayal of characters. Naomi and Ruth are both treated very positively. They're both drawn with depth. In fact, even Ruth, for all that she's got this heroic role, is kind of an interesting character. You know, the way she plays this out with Boaz, and there are scenes with just her. She's the one that initiates going out and going, to get income for the family. That's not Naomi's idea in the beginning. And yet, if you had to pick one character that the story is about, based in a way on the greatest nuance in her character, the ultimate interest of the story, I would argue that it's Naomi. That for all it's called the Book of Ruth, that this is really the story of Naomi, and the observation that it's almost Naomi's child in the end is part of in fact, it literally says that, I think, at the very end. That she says, now I have a son, I think, at the end of chapter 4. They say, blessed, is this it? Naomi took verse 16, Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. Where's the line that says, oh yeah, the women say, a son has been born to Naomi, right? So it reminded me of the Dan el-Akkad story, where it's another ancient story where it's a story about a father, for all that it ends up involving children. So in the end, the story is very much a kind of a picture of a mother's ideal, and that's what Ruth is, like what a mother could dream of in her daughter. And the one major male character is Boaz, who is, if I do say so, a mother's dream. Wealthy, generous, thoughtful, and wealthy. So, again, he's drawn nicely, but in a supporting role for Naomi's benefit. I had a short list of issues of interest: vulnerability of a woman to poverty because of dependence on men, the possibilities of that are present in a bond between women, sort of the benefit, the comfort, the notion that a woman's crisis is solved by women, right? That the entire resolution to this comes out of the planning, scheming of women. And that finally the story is very much about a woman's need for family in order to have status in society. Naomi has lost everything, and the question is, how is she to be restored to some kind of worthwhile life? And that's what takes me back to my sort of class objective, which is this notion that, at least in the horizon of this story, it seems to be presented that for women themselves, this is what they need. And yes, it's all dependent on men, but this is about that dependence viewed from a woman's side. Now, maybe this is all written by men, who somehow, why not, get into a woman's place in that society. But if it was incredibly nuanced and incredibly oriented toward the lives of women and the attitudes of women. So there you go. Hope it's useful. See you next time.